and welcome again to another presentation of the Humanities 231 class of Southwestern Christian College. I'm your instructor, Dr. Barry Graham. We begin with Chapter 1 of your Humanities textbook, Culture and Values, 8th edition, The Beginnings of Civilization. We'll look at a geographical overview of this. In ancient times, countries that today would be called Iran and Iraq over in this area to the right of the map were in ancient times referred to as the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire at various times, the Akkadian Empire, Sumer, Mesopotamia. We also look down here at what would today be called the Holy Lands. The reason why civilization flourished here was because of what is known as the Fertile Crescent. This was very rich soil which made farming possible. The people settled and began to build towns, and that allowed civilization to happen. Up to this time, people were primarily nomadic. It's good for us to define what we mean by civilized. When we talk about civilized, we're talking about urban life, permanent constructions, a system of regulatory government, class distinction. We have wealthy people and people who work jobs. We also have people who work with tools and the development of tools and using their skills, and this allowed them to produce things which they could use to trade with neighboring towns and other civilizations in the absence of money. Written communication was a huge advancement. Another thing they shared in common was a system of religious belief. This helped to unite the people and bring them together. It's important to note that we're not making a value judgment on these religious beliefs. Whether we agree with them or not, it's simply one of the factors that helps bring them together and make civilization possible. As we look at the origins of Western civilization, we look at the Paleolithic world view, meaning the Old Stone Age. We also have art and religion. These are two very common things among all civilizations, but we have the artifacts that remain from ancient civilizations, such as in the Neolithic period. This would be the late Stone Age, the word neo meaning new, or the later times. What made this possible was the domestication of animals used to help till the soil and for travel purposes. This builds a very beneficial relationship between human beings and animals, even in terms of having them as pets. We mentioned farming earlier. The cultivation of vegetation meant that these people could settle in one spot, thus building community. Unfortunately, it also meant the development of war and the weaponry used in war. If one group of people sees something that other people have that they don't, they may take it by force if they're able to. On a more pleasant note, we do see the great development of art even in ancient times. This is in a cave in the Lascaux area of France, and you can see it looks strangely modern. Even to our eyes today, we see the representation of horses and bulls and animals with that appear to be something like antelopes with the horns and things of that nature. People have always been involved in producing visual art. We also see a common theme among the fertility figures. The pregnancy of the woman here is an obvious reference to that. This has been nicknamed a Venus among many of the others that we see in ancient cultures. These are common to all of these ancient civilizations. We then look at the Bronze Age. Somewhere around 3000 BC, we see an explosion of civilization in Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerian civilization. This is where the Abraham of the Bible is called out of. The Semitic civilizations, of which the Hebrews, today referred to as the Jews, are part of that group. The Egyptian civilization was one of the great cultures of this day, as well as the ancient Aegean cultures, who were the ancestors of the Greeks. Again, we emphasize that in 3000 BC, For whatever reason, worldwide, there's an explosion of civilization in different parts of the world. We don't know the exact reasons for this. There are speculations out there among scholars, but to be honest, we simply don't know why in around the year 3000 BC we see this real upturn in the advancement of civilization. Let's look more closely at the Sumerian culture. As I mentioned earlier, this is called Ur of the Chaldees in Scripture. Abraham is called out of this. They had the things in common that we talked about with the agricultural and urban settlements. Again, the Fertile Crescent playing a big role here. Writing and record keeping, specifically cuneiform writing. Cuneiform literally means wedge writing. We really believed up to this point in history at one time that people didn't have writing, but thanks to these discoveries in archaeology, we know that they actually had a very advanced system of writing and record keeping. People thought at one time that Abraham and Moses couldn't possibly have been involved with doing the things that we read in Scripture because people weren't that advanced at that time. We know from these discoveries now that Moses could certainly write. Abraham may have been able to himself. This shared system of religious belief that we talked about, it was polytheistic. Abraham was called out of a worship of many gods to a worship of one God. And we note that many of these ancient cultures worship many gods. The civil rulers and the religious rulers overlap. We remember that at this point in history, there was no separation of church and state. That's a relatively recent happenstance. That's a relatively recent thing in history, just over the last few hundred years or so. But civil rulers and religious rulers were many times the same thing. Here is the cuneiform writing of which we spoke. There you see the wedge type of writing. We've discovered two types. One's called Linear A, the other one's called Linear B. Linear A we've never been able to translate, but we have been able to translate Linear B. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one piece of literature that's found in this cuneiform writing. It's interesting as we look at it and we translate it, we see things that are common even to modern literature in some ways. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we note that this was a ruler. He ruled at Uruk somewhere around 2700 BC, but the first writings that we have on it were composed in Sumerian around 2000 BC on these tablets. In much ancient writing, we don't have anything contemporary with the people that they're writing about. It's usually written years later. It's a pessimistic work. It asserts universal questions about human existence. So as you can see, some themes that we still think about today. Let's look more closely at Semitic culture. During the Akkadian period, we see the rise of the Semites, King Sargon and his descendants around 2350 BC. There was a focus on human achievement. That's why we see all these huge stone monuments to the various rulers. The Gudian invasion marked the downfall of the Akkadians. There was then a return to more traditional practices. And then that brings us to the Babylonian legacy. If you're familiar with your biblical history, of course you've read about the Babylonians. At one time, what it had in the Bible was the only thing we knew about the Babylonians. Today we know more. For instance, the great ruler King Hammurabi. We'll look more at him later. And then finally the Assyrians come into power. This is considered the culmination or the high point of Mesopotamian culture. Here we see a modern restoration of the Ishtar Gate. If the word Ishtar sounds familiar to you, it's where we get our word Easter. Easter wasn't originally a word that had a Christian connotation to it. It's one that's actually borrowed from these ancient Eastern cultures. This was the entrance to the city, and on it we see some representations that are interesting conglomerations of animals that don't exist today, but nonetheless we don't know exactly the purpose of them, whether they just may have been the products of someone's imagination, but they're interesting nonetheless. Here we see a serpent with legs, Again, you might recall that in the book of Genesis, we also have a serpent with legs, and that seems to be common to some of these cultures that were probably around during that time. You also might remember the Tower of Babel in the Bible. Here is an ancient ziggurat. These were these monuments, high, tall monuments that were built in worship and in honor of the stars. The stars were worshipped just like everything else was practically in these polytheistic cultures. So they could use these as observatories to look at the stars, but they were also, of course, designed to worship the stars. You can see the long steps that go to the top. We don't know whether the Tower of Babel, was actually one of these, but it's interesting to speculate on whether it might have been. Here is the great ruler, Gouda. And it's interesting to see in these ancient civilizations how they depicted the rulers. The rulers, of course, want to be depicted in a complimentary manner, and we see it's a very dignified representation of the ruler with the hands folded and the austere kind of expression on the face, again, reflecting in a complimentary way on the ruler himself. Here we see King Hammurabi that we mentioned earlier. Now it's interesting in this one here on the bottom of what's called, this is called a stele, we see writing. And these are the laws of these particular people. These laws are similar to what we read of in the Old Testament. And so it's interesting to think about the similarities between the two, but this is some of the first finds in archaeology that we see. All civilizations come and go, and no different from the Mesopotamian civilization. They were overrun by a people called the Medes. The Medes were nomadic warriors that no doubt wanted these lands and resources that were possessed by the Mesopotamians, and so they come in at some point here and overtake Nineveh in around 612 BC. They conquered, and they were eventually absorbed by another empire called the Persians. If you saw the movie The 300, you watched the Spartans fight against the Persians. Persians became a world empire, of course, at this point. They were also nomadic warriors that no doubt wanted this land. They were conquered by the great Greek ruler Alexander the Great in 330 BC. And at that point, the Greeks become a world empire. There's a prophecy in the book of Daniel in the Bible, and it's interesting to look at the foretelling of the future that's illustrated there. The head of gold represents the Babylonian Empire. The arms and the shoulders and the chest of silver represents the Medo-Persian Empire. We combine those two empires since they happened in rapid succession. And then the bottom area of brass refers to the Greek civilizations, and then the legs and feet of iron is the Roman Empire. It's prophesied that a stone will be cut out without man's hands, and that stone will fill the whole earth, toppling the Roman Empire, which historically is, over a period of time, is what happened when the church came into existence. That brings us to the ancient Egyptian Empire, one of the greatest of ancient times, located in northern Egypt. Manetho's history of Egyptian Greek gives us an outline of Egyptian civilization, one of the first ones we had, or that we have, because this Egyptian historian documented that there were 31 dynasties. He grouped them into 4. Those 4 being the following: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the Late Period. Egypt came about as a civilization because of the Nile River that runs the length of the land of Egypt. It would flood twice a year and so give them fresh soil. The ruler of Egypt, called the Pharaoh, would wear a particular type of headdress, and whether he was a pharaoh of northern Egypt or of southern Egypt, you could tell which one by the headdress itself. Sometimes the kingdoms were united, and the headdress would indicate that as well. We also see it on the mysterious Sphinx up here at the top, which still survives to this day. The gift of the Nile was very significant to the Egyptians. Please don't believe the myths that the missing nose on the Sphinx was the result of Napoleon's soldiers shooting the nose off to camouflage the African American influence. That's strictly an urban legend. Again, we notice that the Nile branches off into the Nile Delta here at the northern part into those three tributaries. And right here in the middle of the land of Egypt, there's an interesting structure there that just happens to be located right on the border of northern and southern Egypt. We'll look at that more in detail here, and here it is. If we look at the center of the landmass there of Egypt, which just so happens to be the landmass longitudinally and latitudinally of this entire planet, there is a structure there, and of course that's the Great Pyramid of Giza. How they knew that that was the center of the landmass, or if they did know, if it's just a lucky coincidence, we don't know for sure, but it's remarkable that that structure was built there, and it still remains there to this day. It's the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and yet it's the only one that still survives. Ancient Egyptian culture was unified and consistent. They were a very provincial people. They were settled, so they were not near as liberal, if you want to use that term, as people who engaged in trade and were constantly in contact with different types of people. Hence, they were resistant to change. We would call that conservative today. So their worldview was certainly affected by external events. The political structure of the ancient Egyptians was embodied in the pharaoh. The pharaoh was the head of the central government. He was regarded as a living god, and as such exercised total and complete absolute power. He was said to order and control all of the visible world. Remember that there's no separation of church and state, so the priests held not only religious power, but political power in that they preserved the religious beliefs and the divine kinship of the pharaohs. In Egyptian religion, there was said to be an obsession with immortality, or what we would refer to as life after death. The Egyptian Book of the Dead gives us much detail about this. It's called the Book of the Dead because it was actually found in a tomb in state with one of the bodies. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we see the various Egyptian gods like Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Remember that the deities and sub-deities and nature spirits worshipped in ancient Egypt were responsible for all aspects of existence, and this underscores the fact that the Egyptians were polytheistic. You know from your biblical history that the plagues that came upon Egypt were actually a statement about their gods and about the fact that the God of the Bible had superiority over all those gods. The principal function of an artist in Egyptian society was to produce images of deities. This helped to coalesce a form of worship and, of course, reinforce the standards set by Pharaoh. The artists were also architects. They provided the temples and shrines for honoring deities. You'll recall that that was the purpose of a temple. The temple was said to be where the gods met the priests, human beings, and that's why the image of the deity was always in the temple. In the Old Kingdom, a significant player was the first architect known to history, Imhotep. Imhotep was said to be the architect behind the Great Pyramids. These were originally thought to be funerary monuments for pharaohs and the upper class. However, it should be pointed out that a body or a corpse has never been found in a pyramid in the history of archaeology. So we really don't know what the purpose of the pyramids was. So you might be thinking, well, where do we actually find mummies and corpses left in state? This ritual of mummification was used to preserve the body as much as possible because it was thought that the preservation of the body was necessary for the survival of the soul. We find these in the Valley of the Kings, that's in the same area there in Giza, not in the pyramids, but in the Valley of the Kings. The great age of the pyramids begins in the area of Giza during the 4th dynasty. The great ruler Cheops, or Khufu in the Greek, was the greatest ruler and the earliest ruler. He was followed by Chephren, and then finally Mycerinus. It raises the question that if these were not funerary monuments, what was the purpose of the pyramids? And even more interestingly, who built the pyramids? Various theories on this. Some thought it might have been farmers that did it during the off-season from farming, and then slaves. But the bottom line is, we really don't know who built the pyramids, and we're not familiar with the technique that they used. Recall that we're talking about as many as 2.5 million stone blocks that were used to construct the Great Pyramid, ranging in weight from 3 tons to 60 tons. Without modern machinery, we have no idea how they hoisted these stones into place, set them in place so precisely. The Great Pyramid hasn't settled so much as an inch into the soil in all of these years. It was originally covered with these glistening limestone casing stones that were removed at some point to build some of the structures in Cairo, Egypt. So the pyramid as we see it today is not as majestic as it originally appeared. As I mentioned, it is constructed of limestone blocks that were quarried, we think, somewhere nearby. There are various theories as to how it was done, but even with our modern technology today, it's doubtful whether we could construct something like the Great Pyramid. It was quarried, ferried, and cut, supposedly dragged into place. We do find center chambers in some of these pyramids, and it was said to have contained the mummified body of the pharaoh surrounded by treasures. Once again, we have to remember that that's never been proven, never been a body found in a pyramid, never any treasures. And that raises the question of, well, perhaps that's because it was plundered by robbers. Certainly that treasure would have been an attractive thing to those people. This is the pyramid as it appears today. Again, we just don't see it in its majestic glory as we see here, as an artist might conceptualize how it appeared back in the day. We don't know, but we do know that it was majestic, covered with these limestone casing blocks. It must have been a sight to behold. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the only one still standing. And it's the oldest. Chephron's Sphinx is another interesting enigma. It was created as the guardian for Chephron's tomb, supposedly his tomb at Giza. It was adopted as a divine symbol of the mysterious and the enigmatic. At least that's what the Greeks wrote hundreds of years later. Here it is, as it appears today. Again, it's good to recall that there are some urban legends around the Sphinx, one of which that the reason why the nose and some of the lips are missing there is because Napoleon's men supposedly shot that off to cover up the fact that when we're talking about ancient Egypt, we're talking about an ancient African culture. That's a myth. There's plenty of statues that still have their noses and their lips. It's just that this was out in the Egyptian landscape where it was prone to erosion. In the art of the Old Kingdom, we note that it reflects confidence and certainty, an idealized realism, and it's conceptual and symbolic. The art of the Middle Kingdom displays a loss of trust in divine providence. The artist attempted to recapture the lofty serenity of the Old Kingdom. and it exemplifies a troubled spirit captured in weight and somber expressions. In the New Kingdom, the artistic traditions continued. They were conceptual. The great pharaoh Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaton, started a massive religious and political reform movement. We see the art there at. It's also in this area that we find the tomb of Tutankhamun, or King Tut, discovered by Howard Carter during a dig between 1922 and 1923. This was incredibly significant because it was the first time an Egyptian ruler was ever found with the tomb intact. No grave robbers had plundered it. It was found in pristine condition. And that's why many of the horror movies have dealt with the mummy's tomb, King Tut. Of course, those are Hollywood sensationalized versions. Please don't go to those to find out about Egyptian history. Here is a depiction of a couple of the rulers of the day, the pharaoh and his queen, and we can see the idealized depiction of their children, one in the lap, one being carried there, and then the sun god up there, the depiction of that. Recall that the Egyptians worshipped everything. This is Queen Nefertiti. Again, she has a strangely modern look to her. The ladies, you'll notice especially the use of the makeup, the mascara, the lipstick, the eye makeup, the long neck, the classic long neck that's still considered very desirable today among runway models, and the jewelry. Standards of beauty go through different changes in history, but this one looks strangely modern. This is King Tut. This was found in his tomb. He was a young pharaoh, died very young in life. You can see that in the depiction there of him. Got the headdress. Here are some other megalithic statues. You see how large they are. Once again, the urban legend that Napoleon's men shot the noses and the mouths off. Obviously, they did not with these. And you see the obvious African features in the depiction of the pharaohs. In the Egyptian late period, artists tended to revisit earlier period styles. They wanted to recapture the realism and the volume of the works. And there was a return to pyramid-shaped tombs, supposedly tombs, even though they never captured the grandeur of the original, especially the Great Pyramid of Giza. Later in history, Egypt was invaded by the Nubians, sometimes referred to as the Kush, around 750, 720 BC. The Nubians and the Nepote preserved the ancient culture of the Egyptians. This will lead us to the ancient Aegean cultures. We find them on the island of Crete. Crete was ruled by the legendary King Minos, with his palace there at Knossos. The Cyclades Islands were prominent in this area, called Cyclades, meaning cycle, because the islands tend to be located in a very rough circle as you look at them on a map. They developed bronze tools. They were very imaginative. We see that in their very humorous pottery and the depictions on those, and in the marble statues and the idols of their day. We see one here looking like modern art, very serene folding of the arms. This looks like it could be in a modern day museum today and could have been produced by a modern day artist. The Bronze Age in Crete was documented by a great archaeologist, Sir Arthur Evans. 1894 through 1900, he began to dig in this area and discovered the early Minoan civilization among these Aegean lands, the ancestors of the ancient Greeks. They saw increasing growth, contact with Egypt and Mesopotamia, and we find scattered towns and civilization there. We also see the evolution of large urban centers. Their art tended to be very lively and colorful. They showed little interest in monumental art, as we saw among the ancient Egyptians, but they did have a very advanced writing system of hieroglyphic signs, hieroglyphic meaning a picture language. For many years, we didn't know this language and Egyptian hieroglyphics were actually a system of writing. We thought it was just a series of pictures, but this is the way people tended to write, and our modern system of writing evolved out of this picture writing. We'll find out later on that the discovery of the Rosetta Stone helped us to decipher the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. Here we see an example of this early ancient Aegean civilization building. We can see a precursor to some of the Greek columns that come along in their temples years later, and we see this here in Knossos and other areas of the ancient Aegean civilizations. Jewelry has always been popular, especially among the upper class and the rulers. This is a bee pendant. You can see the two bees there and their tails touching. And this was no doubt property of one of the queens of the day. The fertility statues, as we mentioned earlier, this is a snake goddess. These tend to be very prominent among archaeological finds, and the reference to fertility should be obvious to you. In the late Minoan culture, we see a period of rebuilding after earthquakes. This was said to be the high point of Minoan culture. The wall paintings are sometimes referred to as frescoes, and the religion centered upon a mother goddess connected with fertility. We saw that in the snake goddess. This is the Mask of Mycenae, a monumental work. It was created by a technique known as terutics, which means the hammering of it means the hammering of facial features using a blunt instrument like a hammer. If you can imagine somebody using a hammer to make something as detailed and beautiful as this, then you get an idea of why it's so amazing. This was at one time thought to be a representation of Agamemnon in ancient Greek culture. Today we know that that's not necessarily the case. We don't know who it's supposed to represent. In discovering ancient Mycenaean culture, this was accomplished because of another great early archaeologist by the name of Heinrich Schliemann. He actually believed that he could find evidence that the Trojan War that Homer writes about in his ancient epic works, he thought that it might actually have happened, that even in these ancient epic